Blog number 33. Once I was a child. Not quite a year ago, I started a blog about my life, about the struggles, the victories, and in general, the things that I found to be amusing. My writing began with a brief history of my childhood, and it has developed into my current life as an adult who deals with spinocerebellar ataxia to the best of my ability. I make light of my current challenges and daily frustrations, and in the future I am planning to stay with that theme. But from the very beginning, various people have commented about reading the views expressed from my childhood and how they had enjoyed them. In light of this thought, I decided to go back to my growing up years and share with you all some more details surrounding that topic in a 3-part series. This will not directly reflect my personal dealings with ataxia, which I usually take head on, but I am happy to give you more of the stories from my growing up years, and so now I would like to present to you Once I Was a Child, Part 1. For me, life began at a very young age, and I strongly suspect that, like many of you, early childhood revolved around the stage of infancy. I know what you are thinking at this point, that to begin my early quest at this particular stage just wasn't very original of me. And I'm sorry, but I was not familiar with the term of copycat yet. I did, however, know the phrase jinx, and I clearly remember the doctor hoisting me up by my ankles, soundly slapping me as he yelled out, "Jinx!" And I remember thinking that this guy clearly just doesn't have a good understanding of the rules of jinx. I mean, how long ago did he get slapped? 35, maybe 40 years ago? But I was in a good mood. I mean, it being my birthday and all. So I bought him a Coke anyway. And later, as we drank our sodas in the doctor's lounge, I went over the rules of jinx with him. He seemed to be clear when I left to go see some of my other buddies, who just so happened to be beginning their childhood adventures too, and were currently laying low in the nursery. The year was 1964, and besides this vivid recollection, everything else was kind of a blur for me until the age when I started kindergarten. This marked an event that will forever be burned into my memory, because it was the first time that I began to experience a random forearm being thrown across my chest at 45 miles per hour whenever my parents would make a quick stop and I was the one who was riding in the front seat of the family car. Honestly, I think I would have sustained less trauma to my little body if I would have been allowed to bounce my head off the dashboard or fly through the windshield. Sometimes I was lucky enough to be in the back seat, flopping around totally unencumbered, working up my last candy-induced spike of blood sugar when the brakes were gently tapped all the way to the floor. Really, at these times, all that would happen was that I would get off a strong whiff and an intimate knowledge of the kind of material used to construct the front seats. Some of my favorite times as a kid happened in the family car. From as far back as I can remember, I have personally been in possession of a sweet tooth. A working theory that I have is that from day one I was given a bottle of chocolate milk, either the kind straight from the carton or the Nestle's Quick Powder formula version that comes in a can. That's got to be the reason why I go weak in the knees and feel totally powerless when I find myself in the presence of a dessert. Actually, just a hint or a slight aroma or the mere suggestion that there may be a dessert will start me hyperventilating and shaking. I also discovered at a young age that I have absolutely no willpower. After I have devoured the sixth cookie or a second piece of cake, I will black out for a few minutes. That's gotta be it, because when I had regained consciousness, I discovered that I've got another cookie or a third piece of cake approaching my mouth, and I have absolutely no recollection of how it got there. And of course, I feel obligated to eat it. I mean, I've already touched it, and I don't want to look like I took it on purpose and then change my mind. And I'm not a quitter, and I would prefer people don't form the opinion that I am an indecisive person. I heard a crazy rumor one time that as a kid, it suggested that there was a link between sweets and obesity. Well, I thought that I might just have to field test that assumption and gather my own data. Of course, I can tell you that the data is still coming in, but the evidence is spreading and stretching in favor of the rumor being true. Dang it. One of the phrases that I heard as a child and I thought to be rather odd was when my mother would say to me, "Don't touch that, you don't know where it's been." I would always respond with, "Oh yeah? We don't know where babies come from either, but that doesn't stop you from touching whenever chance you get." Now you understand that when I say that I always responded this way, that the verbal comeback was always done in my head, right? I mean, I was kind of a daft kid, but I wasn't stupid. Looking back on the whole thing, I am now convinced that my parents had a plan to keep this information from me for as long as possible. I think they were hoping that they could somehow incorporate the whole baby thing into my 21st birthday party. They were saving the big reveal until then, and I'm not sure how it was all supposed to work. Was there going to be charts, maybe graphs or some pictures? I would feign shock and complete surprise and mumbled something like, "I thought the belly button was somehow involved." Sorry, Mom and Dad, but my friends had already clued me in prior to this event. An absolute bittersweet event occurred during my long and sordid career as a child was when my parents would decide to pack my brothers and I into the backseat of the family car and take us out for pizza. This was the sweet part of the memory because, number one, we really liked pizza, and number two, because we always knew that on the way home, after the meal, we'd be stopping at our favorite ice cream parlor for cones. And so we would all pile into the car, drive an hour or so, and hail some pizza, of which my mom was lucky to get any, and leave. Our next stop was the ice cream store, where we are allowed to purchase a double scooped ice cream on a sugar cone. Of course, the cones were usually gone before we left the parking lot, and even on occasion before my dad had a chance to pay. The sweet part of the evening was now over, and the bitter segment of that evening was now about to begin, because the lengthy drive provided my brothers with plenty of time to be creative and come up with new ways to make my life interesting. With their stomachs full of pizza and their veins flowing from the frozen sugar, they would begin to formulate new plans and plot my ultimate demise. But honestly, I've got to say that the old standby was quite effective, and they eventually would always come back to it. So I knew what to expect in that regard, and was just waiting for it. They always made sure I was on one of the ends of the back seat by the door, and they were begin a rousing game of corners. They would violently and gleefully throw themselves to my side of the car like my dad was stunt driving on two wheels, successfully mashing me against the door. I stated that the game was called Corners. Corners with an S. This implies the use of both sides of the car, but I don't recall my dad doing any stunt driving on the other side, and I didn't know anything about machinery or car doors in those days. This statement is in no way meant to be misleading because I still don't know anything about machinery and car doors. But I was scared to death that the door would spring open under the weighty siege of their attacks. In my young mind, I could clearly see myself being sucked out of the door, never to be seen or heard from again. My brothers, I'm sure, would calmly just shut the door, and 30 minutes later, when my parents would do a head count and wonder where I was, they would have responded with a few miles back I had suddenly announced that I needed to stretch my legs and needed to get some fresh air, upon which I opened the door and just stepped out. I was a pretty typical boy, forever being yelled at and or admonished for running with sharp objects. This was a situation where hindsight was really 20/20. Of course, as a child, I never understood that thing. My parents used it frequently, and whenever they did, I would always turn around and look behind me, but I was never able to glimpse at whatever they were talking about. I think the first time that I might have begun to get an inkling as to what they meant by this was when I ran around our camp tent with a friend while playing early settlers and Native Americans. We didn't really call it that then, but hindsight being what it is and wanting to be politically correct and all. I, of course, had a sharpened stick and was having way too much fun to think about the danger I was facing. Not only was I taking a chance that the stick could impale me like a hot dog being prepared for the campfire, but I was also ignoring my father, stupidly thinking that I was safe because he was busy setting up the camp and would probably forget about the whole thing once he smelled the meal that my mother was preparing. Well, I too had many odds stacked against me, and I ended up tripping over the tent peg, cutting the top of my head with a stick. I could have used a full understanding of the 20/20 principle before all the dumb stuff, but I imagine that's how it's supposed to work. Sometime around 1971, when my little brother was born, my parents got a new vehicle, a Suburban. It gave us more room, which provided my older brothers with a pretty good chance to build up some really good momentum before plastering me against the door. But on the positive side, Mom and Dad began to take us to the drive-in because we could watch the first movie, which was usually a classic Disney movie like The Apple Dumpling Gang, and then spread out our sleeping bags on the back and go to sleep while they watched the second movie. Back then, drive-in theaters were the main way of seeing a movie, and we had several large ones close to our house. I have another story that revolves around a drive-in, but it occurred when I was in high school, and so for now, I will leave that subject and come back to it in my next writing. Every summer from 3rd grade on, I went away for a week to summer camp. The summer after 5th grade, I was invited by a friend to attend the camp that he went to. This was a new place for me, and I was looking forward to it. As soon as my friend and I arrived, I knew that I was really going to like this place and would be having a lot of fun. But the first night left me wondering if I had chosen well. I was in my sleeping bag and sound asleep, a skill that I had learned from an earlier age, when I began to dream that a bag was being held over my head. The dream became more violent, and as I struggled more and more, the bag would just press down harder. I was awake now and beginning to panic as I realized that this wasn't just a dream, but I was completely covered by my sleeping bag, and there was a great weight being pressed down upon me. Suddenly, and without warning, the weight moved off and I was released. I threw open my bag to find that every eye from every bunk was on me. And standing next to where I lay was our camp counselor, looking very bewildered and with a very embarrassed expression on his face. Apparently, what had happened was that he had been dreaming that he had caught a baby bear in a sack. And the more that I struggled, the more determined he became to keep it in the sack. Eventually, only seconds that felt like minutes, the noise had awoken everyone in the cabin, which successfully awoke the counselor, who quickly realized his mistake and released me. But besides being mistaken for wildlife, I loved the camp and went back every summer until I graduated from high school. In the 1974-75 school year, I was in 4th grade, and to the best of my recollection, this was when I began to catch faint wisps of a rumor that at this point was rather elusive and vague, but that brought with it a chill in the air. It wasn't until the next school year, when my older brothers entered high school, that the strange tales and haunting stories of freshman hazing became a reality. But I was only in 5th grade and had other concerns. Besides, I still had a long stretch of 4 years, which seemed like a lifetime in my young mind, before I needed to worry. This mindset worked flawlessly and carried me worry-free until dinner time on the evening of my brother's first day of high school. The evening meal that night was filled with stories of the most hapless freshmen who were singled out of the herd to push a penny with their nose around a toilet seat. Tales were told and pictures were painted in my mind of victims being lined up in bathroom stalls and to become the receiver of the dreaded swirly. The basic idea behind the aptly named swirly, for those of you who may not know, is to have the toilet flushed while one's head is politely and gently introduced to the bowl and then held underwater, causing the hair to swirl when the bowl is flushed and the water swirls around and spirals down. If the head is kept in place until the water finishes swirling and gone down the drain, the result is a twisted and wet hairdo. I have come close on several occasions, while bent over and cleaning the bowl at home, to falling forward and performing a self-administered swirly. This has happened when I have been engaged in a routine cleaning of the bowl, and trust me on this one, if I did immerse my head on accident, my arms would start to flail about in shock, and my hand would eventually find the handle, successfully giving myself a quickie hair wash. I have gotten myself in many seemingly impossible scenarios, but my high school years will be covered in part 2 of this series titled, Once I Was a Teenager.